I'm Thinking of Ending Things is a beautifully terrifying film written and directed by Charlie Kaufman and based off the book of the same name by Ian Reid. Kaufman has written and produced 6 films, including the critically acclaimed Being John Malkovich and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Kaufman's unique style and recurring themes are present in all of his films, but these are intensified in his 3 most recent films, Synecdoche, New York, Anomalisa, and I'm Thinking of Ending Things. These films were also directed by Kaufman, giving him seemingly complete control over the story he wanted to tell. He uses this control to crank his consistent themes of life, death, love, and identity up to 100 in a beautifully crafted experience that can be individualized to each viewer. While his films are abstract and can be difficult to watch, their unique experience to the viewer can leave one pondering for days, weeks, or years. Kaufman consistently leaves me feeling this way, especially with Synecdoche, New York, and his newest film, I'm Thinking of Ending Things. Probably because to me, I'm Thinking of Ending Things ties closely with the themes of Synecdoche. In this essay, I'm going to break down everything about this film. I'm going to analyze every part of I'm Thinking of Ending Things and give my personal interpretations on it. I don't think I've sold the movie or anything, these are simply my opinions. Kaufman presents his films in a way that each viewer can have a unique experience and form their own views. He encourages this himself, as he stated multiple times that he doesn't want to just give people the answers, but instead let them experience the art for themselves.
No, it's not a burden. It's more like the whole point of writing something is to have people experience it. And if I sit here and say, well, this means this and this means this, not only is it pointless because it either means that to people or it doesn't, it also gets in the way of people having their individual experience of the movie. So I try to put enough of in there so that people can interact with it on an individual basis. So my sort of pontificating on it would be meaningless.
I'm sure everyone watching has had a different experience than me, so please let me know how you guys interpreted things because I'd love to hear different interpretations. In this video, I'm going to be spoiling I'm Thinking of Ending Things, as well as parts of Synecdoche, New York, so please watch both films at least once before watching this. I'm Thinking of Ending Things is a seemingly simple plot where we follow a young woman named Lucy as she goes with her boyfriend Jake to visit his parents. Lucy spends her trip contemplating ending her relationship as well as trying to figure out herself. Just like the other Kaufman films, there's no way to describe the plot in a way that will do the film justice. It must be experienced to be understood, and usually that takes multiple watches. This film is classified as a drama, thriller, and horror, and I've heard plenty of criticism towards the horror classification as it doesn't fit the general mold of that genre. The reason it stands out from the horror genre is because its horror comes from its feeling of existential dread and how that plays out in the lives of the viewer. The movie isn't scary because of what's on the screen, but because of how what's happening on the screen is represented in the life of the viewer. This divergence from the standard horror film, as well as it being a Kaufman film, has led to a massive range of positive and negative reviews and experiences. Kaufman tends to polarize the audience with the films he directs, as they tend not to appeal to most movie watchers. Many criticize them as coming off as pretentious, which is a fair assessment even though I disagree, but it's amazing how Kaufman is able to put together these beautifully crafted, unique experiences. The film starts with the title screen, where small white text is surrounded by darkness that fades slowly into and out of existence. Right off the bat, we can see the parallels to Synecdoche, New York in its opening credits as well as its greater themes. We'll be seeing the relationships between these two a lot in this film. Nothing in Kaufman's films is there by accident, even the text. Just like the life of the janitor, who we will see shortly, the text quickly and meaninglessly fades in and out of existence. Did it really even serve any purpose? The text is also small and white, surrounded by an overpowering amount of darkness. We'll see plenty more of the overpowering darkness throughout the film. In fact, we even get right into it as the title screen shifts into the beginning of the movie and we see that it has a 4:3 aspect ratio instead of the standard 16:9, which causes both sides of the screen to have black bars. I believe this choice by Kaufman represents a few things. First, it helps to add to the grim and depressed tone Kaufman presents throughout the film. It also adds a sort of feeling of claustrophobia where every character is surrounded by darkness. Lastly, it's fitting for the setting. We only get vague clues at their location and time period, but it seems to take place in Oklahoma. The time period shifts a few times, but judging by Guy Boyd's real-life age of 77, the actor who plays the janitor in the present day, I think it's a fair guess that the janitor is roughly 70. If we're to guess that Jake and Lucy are around their mid-20s to early 30s, that'd put us around the late 1970s, early 1980s. We'll talk more about the time period later in the film though. As the film starts, we hear our protagonist Lucy speaking, with the first line being,
I'm thinking of ending things.
This line references 2 things. The first being her thinking about ending her relationship with her boyfriend Jake, and the second referring to ending her own life. In Lucy's internal monologue, she states that when her suicidal thoughts start intruding, they are impossible to get rid of. She also talks about them as if they aren't new, and have only become stronger over time. Perhaps this implies that she's been passively suicidal for a while, meaning that she wishes for or would be okay with dying but wouldn't do it herself, but only recently started to become more actively suicidal, meaning that she's desiring to actively end her own life. While Lucy is speaking, we also hear the same music played during the dance at the end of the film. It's strangely beautiful and peaceful despite the topic being discussed. Nothing about this monologue seems remotely happy. She doesn't seem to have any joy in her relationship with Jake. Throughout this introduction, we also get establishing shots of Jake's parents' home, which is where much of this film will take place. Towards the end of Lucy's internal monologue, we hear her questioning details about her relationship with Jake. Lucy's thoughts get cut off shortly as we get our first sight of the janitor as he watches Lucy from the window while we hear what sounds like him quietly talking in the background.
The assumptions are right. I can feel my fear growing now.
At this point, I want to note that almost everything we see in this film isn't real, but is being played out in the imagination of the janitor. Lucy, Jake, and his family are all part of the janitor's daydream. Lucy is set as the main character of the janitor's daydream, and she represents two major things to me. The first is the girlfriend of his younger self, Jake, who's taking his girlfriend to visit his parents. I'll bring up the second a bit later when it's more fitting. But regardless, this means that almost everything that any character thinks or says in this film is coming from the janitor. Throughout the film, we constantly see the details of both Lucy as an individual and of her relationship with Jake changing as the janitor is playing with different scenarios in his imagination, whether it be how they met, what she's studying in school, or even her name, but we'll get to that when we get there. Going back briefly to what the voice mumbled from the window as we saw the janitor, we actually hear this voice a few times throughout the film. I believe this voice represents the janitor's suicidal thoughts, which attempt to impede his daydream throughout the day, but I'll talk more about that later. While Lucy's inner monologue continues, the shot cuts back inside and we see that Jake is standing at the window instead of the janitor, giving us the initial clue that they are the same person. The shot cuts back outside and we see that Lucy is getting into the car with Jake as they share a cute moment together. The sequence feels very cinematic with the music, brief dialogue, and camera work. Now, obviously it's supposed to be cinematic, right? It's a movie. But this is all taking place in the head of the janitor. He's imagining this sequence as being very cinematic. It seems that the janitor has a strong appreciation and passion for TV, film, poetry, and theater, as these are pretty much the only things that bring him out of his daydream throughout the day. We see it as he's in the house preparing for work in the morning, when he's watching the students rehearsing Oklahoma, and when he's eating dinner at the school. We will also see this passion constantly coming up in his daydream. We don't see any scenes like this for the rest of the film. When the short sequence ends and the music stops, we see Lucy and Jake in the car together, and Lucy immediately thinks to herself, I'm thinking of ending things.
I'm thinking of ending things.
Huh?
What?
Did you say something?
No, I don't think so.
Weird.
Yeah.
This thought becomes the cue for a cinematic experience to come to an abrupt stop. Even though Lucy only thinks I'm thinking of ending things, Jake asks what she said as if it was out loud. Now we know that everything is going on in the janitor's head, so it's not exactly like Lucy's thoughts are a secret from Jake. But why would Jake interrupt Lucy? One reason could be because he wants to stop Lucy from thinking about ending the relationship. But why would Lucy even think about ending the relationship in the first place? Strangely enough, the janitor's entire daydream is depressing and dark. This is fitting though, if I'm thinking of ending things is referring to suicidal thoughts. And now when we see Jake interrupt Lucy, it's like he's trying to stop his suicidal thoughts in their tracks.
I'm thinking of ending things.
Huh?
What?
Did you say something?
No, I don't think so.
I believe this entire daydream is an attempt to combat the janitor's suicidal ideation. Given how mundane and boring his life seems as we get glimpses at it throughout the film, he clearly would have a lot of time to meditate on his suicidal thoughts, so daydream or fantasy is really the only counter he seems to have. But like I mentioned a bit ago, the whole experience is strangely depressing. It's like he isn't capable of providing himself any level of happiness and joy, even in his own fantasy. We're not even 4 minutes into the movie, and this is already the third time we're hearing suicidal thoughts coming in. The first was the very first line of the film, and the second being the voice coming from the window. This pace isn't consistent for the entire movie though. I think the janitor struggles with these thoughts more at the start of his day because he knows he has an entire day ahead of him. When he gets to work and starts distracting himself, the thoughts slow down, but don't completely go away. Only a few seconds later, and we hear them for the fourth time.
I think of ending things. What's the point in carrying on like this? I know what it is, where it's going. Jake is a nice guy, but it's not going anywhere. I've known this for a while now.
This time though, Lucy's thoughts start off seemingly as suicidal ideations, but then switch to Lucy thinking of ending her relationship with Jake instead. Jake seems to know what she's thinking, but he doesn't say anything for a while. The janitor probably allows these thoughts to go on since he's able to make them relevant to the daydream instead of focusing on suicide, but he still can't manage to rid these thoughts completely. Sure, imagining your girlfriend breaking up with you is better than thinking about killing yourself, but it's still depressing for a fantasy. The brief dialogue we do get from Jake and Lucy is awkward, fitting to the mood of the depressing daydream.
Do you want to stop for a coffee or something? A snack? It's going to get pretty farmy pretty fast now.
I'm fine.
You sure?
Don't want to spoil my appetite.
Okay.
We now get the first cut out of the daydream and into the present day of the janitor as we see him eating breakfast and watching TV. On the TV is Peabody's Improbable History, which was used as a segment on the Rocky and Bullwinkle show from 1959 to 1965. This must have been a cartoon the janitor watched as a child, which would help confirm his age of roughly 70. We get a brief cut back into the fantasy as the janitor stops watching TV and finishes getting ready, and Jake tells Lucy that she might want to consider stopping for a snack because his mother isn't well and might not be up for cooking. He doesn't give specific details on her health, and he comes off as reserved, which is obviously strange given the situation. Perhaps he's not ready to revisit the specifics of his mother's health yet, or maybe he hasn't decided on which state of health his mother would be in exactly. Regardless, this adds another sad element to the fantasy. It gives us the impression that the janitor is trying to imagine a realistic scenario of him bringing his girlfriend to visit his family. Maybe the janitor's depression is seeping in and is alluding that there isn't now or wasn't ever much to be happy or joyful about. The film cuts back to the janitor as he gets in the car and starts heading to work. We get a brief shot of a bag from Tulsi Town, the fast food place where Lucy and Jake stop later in the film. He turns on the radio station where a pastor is giving a sermon. This short clip gives us the impression that the janitor is religious. This certainly fits the setting as we have a man who was raised and is living in the Bible Belt in the 70s, and evangelical Christianity is the common religious denomination here. Now that we've established the janitor's religious views, I want to address my second interpretation of what I think Lucy represents. As I mentioned previously, Lucy represents the imaginary boyfriend of Jake, the younger version of the janitor. The second thing Lucy represents to me is a female version of the janitor. Now I know this might sound strange at first, but there are tons of pieces of evidence to stick out to me here. First, Lucy is the main character of this fantasy, not Jake. All of the janitor's thoughts are heard through Lucy, not Jake. Lucy is also the source where the janitor's suicidal thoughts come from, and she is the one who receives the phone calls where the voice is speaking the janitor's suicidal thoughts. But one of the most important pieces of evidence of this for me comes from the context of Christianity. Let's start with the names. The name Jake is short for Jacob, which is from the story of Jacob and Esau in the book of Genesis. Jacob and Esau were the sons of Isaac and Rebekah. God revealed to Rebekah shortly before her birth that she would deliver twins that would represent two nations, one being stronger than the other. When Rebekah delivered, Esau was born first and was extremely hairy. Jacob was born second and was smooth-skinned. Jacob also came out of the womb grasping the heel of his brother to foreshadow their future of conflict, but also signifying Esau's dominance. As the twins grew up, Esau became the stereotype for masculinity. He was a skilled hunter and a brash man. He was also his father's favorite. Jacob was a quiet man who stayed at home in the tents doing housework. Fittingly, Jacob was his mother's favorite. Esau was the definition of stereotypical male traits, while Jacob fell more into the category of stereotypical female traits. One day, Esau returned home from a day of hunting, and as he was starving, he demanded Jacob for some soup he had just prepared. Jacob told Esau he would give him the soup in exchange for his birthright, which is basically an inheritance and a special honor that Esau held exclusively because he was the older son. Esau foolishly agreed and took the soup because he was thinking impulsively and didn't take the request seriously. When the time came for their father, Isaac, to give the birthright to his son, he told Esau to go out and hunt some game to prepare a meal for him. While Esau was away, Rebekah helped her favorite son Jacob trick Isaac into giving him the birthright. She prepared a meal and dressed Jacob to give him the impression of being Esau so he could fool his father's poor sight. Isaac blessed Jacob, promising him the inheritance of God's covenant, which is the promise that God gave to Isaac's father Abraham that said that Abraham would be the father of all nations and that his descendants would number the stars in the sky. Esau returned to discover the deception and the stolen blessing, so Jacob fled in fear. Now, there's plenty more to this story, but I don't want to go through the entire thing. The most important thing to note from the story is its themes of gender roles and its reversal of expectations. Esau was born first. He fit all the stereotypes of a great man. He was strong, brash, and seemingly built to lead. Despite this, the more feminine of the two was the one who inherited God's covenant. Biblically, the name Jacob means to follow or to be behind as a reference to his birth. This name fits Jake perfectly. He has clearly fallen behind the standards of society as he now works as a janitor, a stereotypical job of a failure. He has no wife and no kids. He's failed to fit the role of a father. He's also failed to reach even his own standards. Throughout the film, we get glimpses at his passions and potential through his art and his mom's praises, but see that all of it has been wasted. Jake's name also fits in the context of his struggles with gender identity. On the other hand, we have Lucy. She goes by a few names in this film, but all but one are variants of Lucy. I believe Lucy is short for Lucifer, which is another name for Satan, or the devil. This would be a fitting name for the janitor to give his female self with the context of his religious beliefs. The standard Christian view is that being transgender is a sin as it violates God's design, so the janitor probably views this as a sinful indulgence. I believe that Lucy is partially meant to be a representation of sin in many ways, with this being the first. We'll get to the others later on. Let's go back to the verse that was playing on the radio, Isaiah 1:18. The verse says, "Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, they shall be like wool." Now, I'm actually colorblind, so I might make some mistakes when I'm talking about colors, so I apologize in advance. But when we see Lucy throughout most of this film, she's wearing a reddish color scheme. She even has red hair, and red in this verse is meant to symbolize sin. Now, I'm not saying that Jake is transgender necessarily. I believe Lucy is meant in part to be a representation of a female version of the janitor, but I don't think he's entirely invested with the desire to be female. Perhaps his daydream is one of many, and the young female version of the janitor is an anomaly. But I think that instead, Lucy represents a struggle with gender identity that the janitor has faced for a while. The idea behind what makes a man in US culture is certainly different in 2020 than it would have been in the 50s and 60s when the janitor was young. He would have been raised in a culture fresh out of 2 world wars, and in a culture where a man was meant to be strong and emotionless, like Esau. This is why the story of Jacob and Esau fits perfectly. I think the janitor feels more like Jacob in a world where people wanted him to be Esau. With this in mind, one can interpret that Lucy doesn't represent the janitor wanting to be female, but rather the janitor putting his culturally feminine qualities into a different identity. This would be far from the first time we've seen the idea of gender identity and gender roles come up in a Kaufman film. In fact, they're present in all of his films. I don't want to take the time to address all of them or dive deep into anything, but since I mentioned Synecdoche, New York already, I want to point out the massive part gender identity plays in that film. Caden struggles with gender identity in small and big ways throughout the film, from taking up stereotypical women roles like cleaning, to smelling like he's menstruating, to resembling, being mistaken for, or maybe even becoming Ellen.
You smell weird. You wearing lipstick?
No. What do I smell like? Like bad? Like a old person?
I don't know, like mold and cleaning products, like you're menstruating. I don't know.
Menstruating?
You tell me.
I don't menstruate, so I don't know. I can smell like I'm menstruating.
I wouldn't know.
Lucy, being a female version of the janitor, is also symbolized to me through the broken swing set at the janitor's house that we've been shown a couple of times by this point. To me, this represents Jake being a normal or fixed part of the janitor, while Lucy is the damaged or broken part. I want to step away from this theory for now because I'll continue to discuss it throughout the film as it's relevant, but I do want to note one more thing. Now I have to put on my tinfoil hat for this one. When I was writing this essay, I noticed something outside of the film that stuck out to me. The 2 main actors in this film, Jessie Buckley and Jesse Plemons, share the same first name, which also happens to be a gender-neutral name. Now, I personally believe this is just a happy accident, but who knows, maybe Kaufman did do this semi-intentionally. Okay, now let's get back to the movie. So, I need to back up for a minute for this shot, but shortly after Lucy's first thoughts about ending her relationship with Jake, she pulls down the visor to look in the mirror, but it's mostly broken. This is fitting for multiple reasons, as she's thinking about how her relationship with Jake is broken. The damaged reflection shows how Lucy's in the wrong place and maybe with the wrong person. Since I believe Lucy is a representation of the janitor, the same idea applies to almost everything in a janitor's life. His mind is broken as he battles depression and suicide. His body is broken as he may be wrestling with gender dysphoria. His career is broken as he is working past normal retirement age in one of the most pathetic jobs in our culture. His relationships are broken as they all no longer exist. He doesn't even know who he is anymore, and he doesn't know if he's capable of being anything worthwhile. As the conversation between Jake and Lucy continues, Jake assures Lucy that his parents are looking forward to meeting her. Lucy then starts to worry internally about her relationship with Jake and taking this next step by meeting his parents. It's interesting to think about this scene in the context of Lucy being Jake.
She hasn't been feeling well.
Getting old ain't for sissies, as Betty Davis said.
True, although one might just take issue with her use of the word sissy.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Yes. It was a different time.
There are lots of times we get exchanges like this where Jake and Lucy awkwardly try to make sure their language isn't offensive. It's like they're unnaturally trying to be more politically correct, but not in a bad way. This dialogue certainly feels accurate for what a roughly 70-year-old man would try to say given the massive cultural shifts he's trying to keep up with. Jake then brings up the poet William Wordsworth in his poem Intimations of Immortality. He says that this is because the poem suddenly popped into his head, not so coincidentally right after Lucy thought.
I guess it's curiosity. Jake is certainly hard to figure. Maybe it's like a window into his origins. The child being father of the man and all.
Are you a fan of Wordsworth then?
Wordsworth?
William Wordsworth, the poet?
I'm not familiar really. Why'd you ask?
Because thinking about him for some reason, he popped into my head.
The conversation slowing down gives Lucy a chance to start thinking about suicide again, so Jake offers to recite the poem for her, but she declines.
I'm thinking
Get your Wordsworth with Wordsworth.
Fired.
Do you want to hear how it starts? It's just that
I'm not a metaphorical type
it's just
gal.
that one speaks to me.
The first stanza of the poem reads, The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. The poem is about the formative years of childhood, and how they helped to make Wordsworth the man and the poet that he became. The first line expresses that our childhoods shape our adulthoods, which then go on to shape our children's adulthoods, and so on. How fitting for Jake, as he's on this inner journey where he explores different identities that he could have had, and different lives he could have lived. But in the end, these may have been inevitable, or at least much more difficult to achieve, as he was shaped by external forces.
Incidentally, Wordsworth wrote a series of poems to a woman named Lucy.
Like me.
A beautiful, idealized woman who dies young.
Yikes.
Well, the comparison goes only as far as your name.
This makes perfect sense, as not only would Jake want to recognize the love of his life as a beautiful, idealized woman, but if Lucy is also a representation of Jake, then of course he'd view her as a superior version of himself. Lucy then gets her first phone call of the film. We know from later in the film that these phone calls are the janitor's suicidal thoughts. First off, the phone call is from a person named Lucy. This helps further the idea that Lucy is the janitor, as well as contributes to the idea that Lucy is short for Lucifer, as the idea that suicidal thoughts can come from Satan is present in Christianity. Lucy declines the phone call though, as she is strong enough at this point in the day to fend off the suicidal ideation. Right after she declines the phone call, she takes off her coat, followed by a sigh of relief. It's as if a weight was lifted off her shoulders as she was able to shrug off the thoughts. Right after she declines the phone call, she notices the same swing set from the janitor's house, but this time it's not broken. Strangely enough, even though the swing set seems to be in perfect condition, the house behind it is basically completely destroyed. Perhaps this is a representation of an idea the janitor has that if he does commit to his true identity, and doing what is best for himself, it will shatter the people around him, like his parents. Even though Lucy notices the swing set in an abandoned house, Jake says he doesn't notice at all. Of course Lucy would want to consider this thought, but Jake is ignoring it because he doesn't want to consider the consequences.
They're saying, there might be a fair amount
Yeah?
of snow. They're predicting it.
Do you think we should maybe turn back? We've got a fair amount of, well, a lot actually of work to do tomorrow. I need to get home tonight so that I
I
can
think
deal
we'll be
with it.
okay. I've got tire chains in the trunk.
The snowstorm here is a representation of all the struggles going on with Jake, Lucy, and the janitor at this point. Lucy's instinct is to try to do something about it, or to try to avoid the storm completely, but Jake insists that it will be okay and that he has tire chains if necessary. The tire chains are brought up a few times throughout the film whenever worry is expressed about the snowstorm. On one hand, it could be meant to represent a positive thing as it is a tool that can help Jake and Lucy power through the hardships. For example, the tire chains being present gives the janitor's fantasy an excuse to keep going despite the looming doom of his suicidal ideation. On the other hand, chains can represent a form of baggage, causing Jake to feel trapped and out of control. I think the tire chains are there to represent both simultaneously. They allow the janitor to keep moving forward, but for what? They're not solving any problems. He's still trapped, but they're allowing the janitor to continue onward.
What are you working on?
Oh, I have a paper due Wednesday.
Which one is this?
Susceptibility to rabies infection in the sensory dorsal root ganglion
The
neurons.
trigeminal ganglia as well, right?
Yes, exactly.
Worked for me.
Just like her name and clothing, Lucy's career also changes multiple times throughout the film. Right now she's writing a paper about rabies infection, but later she'll be an artist, or a physicist, or a waitress. I believe Jake is not only imagining what it would be like to be dating different types of people, but he's also imagining what he could have been like.
I really do need to get back tonight. Deal with it first
I'll
thing.
get you home. Chains.
James.
I mentioned earlier that the janitor almost exclusively snaps out of his daydream when he's interrupted by theater, film, etc., but this time doesn't include any of those. Instead, he snaps back to reality as he gets made fun of by a couple students. This dialogue matches his emotional pain as he ponders his pitiful existence. This sequence goes to show us why he has this daydream in the first place. He needs to forget. He needs to escape. And as he is able to return to his fantasy, we once again see that Lucy is the main character of this dream, not Jake.
Sorry, what?
I asked if you want to listen to some music.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Be careful out there, folks. It's looking treacherous.
When you get out this far, there's not much signal.
As Jake turns on the radio, we get some not so subtle foreshadowing for both the janitor's fantasy and reality. The song that comes on the radio next is from the play Oklahoma, which plays a large part in the film. Jake further expresses his passion for the arts, this time for plays specifically. He then goes on to mention how he'll see kids who performed in Oklahoma at the high school around town as they're older. Of course, this would make sense since the janitor would see tons of different kids performing Oklahoma year after year. After this thought, we transition into the present to see that the janitor is cleaning the theater while some students are rehearsing the same song that was playing on the radio. The song being sung is called Many a New Day, which is about this young woman reflecting on her vast potential with love interest, as well as how quickly her life is flying by as she enjoys it. As if it wasn't enough for the janitor to have his doom symbolized here, the actress even visibly displays her disgust towards the janitor as he tries to enjoy the performance.
That's why I like road trips. It's good to remind yourself the world's larger than the inside of your own head, you know?
How ironic.
Perspective.
It is beautiful out here. In a bleak, heartbroken kind of way. What was the last road trip I took? I should remember, but I don't. Nothing's coming to mind. It's odd, foggy about so many things lately.
On one hand, we expect Lucy's memories to be shallow since she's just a fictional character created by the janitor, but I think this is actually reflecting the janitor specifically. As his father got older, he started to develop Lewy body dementia. Now, even though LBD is a fairly common disease for older people, it's actually not entirely genetic, although it does increase one's chances. This line from Lucy could be a way of showing the janitor's decrease in cognitive abilities, or it could be a way of showing his fear and anxiety of developing the same sickness his father had. Jake asks Lucy if she's been working on any poetry lately, as she's now a poet as well, and Lucy goes on to recite a poem called Bone Dog. This poem's actually by a woman named Ava H.D., not Lucy. Now, I won't show the entire poem here, but it's basically about loneliness and how mundane and dreary the repetition of life can be. As Lucy recites the final stanza, she creepily stares directly into the camera, as if she's talking directly to us as well as directly to the janitor. Guess that means we, the viewer, or the janitor here.
You come back with X-ray vision. Your eyes have become a hunger. You come home with your mutant gifts to a house of bone. Everything you see now, all of it, bone.
You can only repeat the same dull routine for so long. You can only suffer so much. You can only fake it so often, until there's nothing left. Now, again, I'm colorblind, so sorry if I messed this up, but when Lucy starts reciting the poem, she's wearing her red sweater, but towards the middle of the poem it turns pink, before returning back to red at the end. Despite how pink is more of a happy, peaceful, and loving color, at this point of the poem she's discussing how awful it is being at home. Perhaps the pink is meant to symbolize the fake happiness and loving attitude she gives off while she's at home. This makes sense in Jake's case as we know that he has a complicated relationship with his parents. He obviously loves them, but there's clearly a ton of baggage and bad memories there. The shift back to red can symbolize his true self, passionate and still loving, but also angry and most importantly sinful. As Jake's parents got older and more sick, he started having to take care of them more, and after years of deteriorating, eventually watched them die. He was able to build up plenty of anger and resentment towards their suffering, but he also had time to build up resentment and anger towards the way they raised him. Maybe the janitor felt it was their fault he grew up to become a miserable failure.
Wow, it's amazing. It's like you wrote it about me.
I guess that's what one hopes for when writing a poem.
What's that?
Some universality in the specific, I don't know.
It's like you wrote it about me.
I'm thinking of ending things.
Once again, as she reminisces about the sorrows of her past, her suicidal thoughts return. And right before she repeats the title of the movie, she gives one final glance directly our way. Not so coincidentally, right after Jake repeats that it's like she wrote it about him. Just like a poet wants their art to have a personal relationship with the reader, Kaufman wants his film to have a personal relationship with the viewer. Even though Kaufman wrote this movie about himself, he also wrote it about each individual viewer. This is partially why his films have an incredibly diverse amount of interpretations. He presents the story in a way that everyone can have a personalized experience. On top of this, every time you watch, you'll probably have a different experience. Partly because there's so much going on that there's always something new to find, but also because if you watch the film at different points in your life, you'll go into it with different perspectives and take different meanings out of it. After some awkward pestering from Jake, Lucy mentions she's thinking about time and the inevitability of its continuation.
I guess I was thinking about time.
Really?
Yeah. Like we're on a train and it takes us where it takes us. There's no veering off, there's no side trips, and like Mussolini's train, it runs on time.
That's not really true about Mussolini trains. The improvements in the railway system preceded him. He just took the credit. And even still, they didn't always run on time.
I wasn't really talking about Mussolini's train.
Anyway, you can always jump off a train.
Movies. Real life, you'll probably die jumping from a moving train.
That's very true. I suppose I watched too many movies.
Everybody does. Societal malady.
Interesting how Kaufman would insult his own profession like that. But since we're stuck on the unstoppable time train anyways, why not try to find some distractions from everyday boredom and suffering?
It's like the rabies virus, attaching itself to our ganglia, changing us into itself.
Viruses are monstrous.
Everything wants to live, Jake. Viruses are just one more example of everything.
But did you know there are insects that blow themselves up?
Yes,
Not everything wants to live.
There are certain ants, certain aphids.
For the good of their community.
They're suicide bombers.
Here, Jake hints at the idea that suffering doesn't have to be a bad thing if it causes some greater good. This is another Christian belief, that one's painful journey can still have positive consequences and result in the greater good. For example, someone could spend their first 20 years of life being brutally abused and falling into a devastating drug addiction to cope, but their journey to rock bottom can reveal God's unconditional love to them, which is infinitely greater than the suffering they endured previously. Given Jake's past, he's likely had to wrestle with the idea of suffering for the greater good his entire life. Why does he have to be alone? Why does he have to work a dead-end job? Why do his parents have to suffer? Why does he have to deal with his gender dysphoria? It's likely he doesn't see the greater good beyond his suffering, and for good reason. Where is it exactly? This doesn't mean the janitor's entire life has been meaningless suffering, of course. He's likely done a lot of good for many people throughout his life, but during his depressed state, all those ideas and thoughts are far away from his mind. We now see a billboard for Tulsi Town Dairy, and the pig moves and says,
Come. Join me.
At the end of the film, we see the janitor hallucinating or dreaming about this pig in what are likely his final moments before death. Given this, it's fair to assume that the pig is yet another manifestation of suicidal ideation. And right after this, Jake says,
So not everything wants to live. Right?
And now, Jake and Lucy have finally arrived at his parents' house. I feel like this is a good spot to wrap up the first part of the series. So far, we're 22 minutes into the movie, and this video is far longer than that. But I don't think this ratio will stay the same all the way through. Hopefully when you're watching this, I'm already hard at work on part 2. So in the meantime, let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on I'm Thinking of Ending Things. I'm sure no one watching had the exact same experience I did, so I'd love to know how you all interpreted things. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.